So we've had two very interesting presentations on energy issues from an international perspective. And now we're going to turn to domestic policies and domestic issues. And we're very pleased that we were able, that two of the campaigns for the Pennsylvania U.S. Senate seat were able to send representatives on behalf of their campaigns to talk about energy issues. We're especially pleased that we have Dick Celeste with us to be the examiner, questioner, interviewer for this purpose. Dick Celeste is one of the great Americans of his generation and a great person. Don't laugh, Dick, it's true. He, a Yale graduate, Rhodes Scholar, degree therefore from Oxford. He's had a remarkable career as a two-term governor of Ohio, former director of the Peace Corps, U.S. ambassador to India, president of Colorado College, probably his hardest job of all of those, speaking as a college president myself, and a leader in many, many ways, involved with many nonprofit actors related to energy, environment, and many other things. He's really a remarkable public servant who's had great impact during his career. So we're very honored to have him here with us, who will be conducting what we're calling a fireside chat. So, right, Dick's looking around for the fireplace. Right. It's a virtual fireplace. I can feel the heat all the way from over here. So, of course, it's a figurative fireside chat to indicate the kind of setting that it is. Dick, thank you very much for being here. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to join you for Energy Week here at Carnegie Mellon University, and to be with someone who I respect enormously, not only for his leadership of this institution while he was president, but for the many other ways in which he serves the community locally and nationally and internationally. So it's a pleasure to be here. Fireside chat, I was reminded of Harry Truman's comment. You know, he said, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Well, I'm not sure there's a fire here, but we're in the kitchen, I guess, John, to have conversation about public policy and energy. Let me introduce my first partner in conversation, John Hanger. John is the former head of the Department of Environmental Protection here in Pennsylvania. You served there for Governor Rendell, as I understand, and have been Governor Tom Wolf's secretary for planning and policy until very recently. Before that, you served on the Public Utilities Commission. You've worked in areas that involve energy advocacy on behalf of citizen organizations, and you even ran for governor at one point. So I have a great identification with you. Anyone who's willing to do that deserves a lot of respect and learns a lot about the state in the process.
You're absolutely right about that.
Well, let's begin. You're here on behalf of your candidate to talk about her thoughts in the energy, broadly speaking, the energy field. Is there a way in which you would characterize your candidate's environmental policy, broadly speaking, just by way of introduction?
Well, first, she is really an expert in the environment and energy. We would send not only the first woman to Washington, D.C. as a Pennsylvania senator after 200 years or more of men only, we would send the first energy expert and environmental expert in Katie McGinty. She's extraordinarily well qualified in a broad range of subjects, but she has very much spent her life working to improve our environment. Few people in the country have done more on the issue of climate change than Katie McGinty, because one of her very first public service jobs was with Al Gore. And of course, Al Gore was, and still is, a national and global leader on climate change. So what Pennsylvanians have is this amazing opportunity to send a supremely well-qualified woman who is also an authentic energy expert and a champion for clean energy and a clean environment.
Has she taken a position on the Clean Power Plan?
She's a strong supporter.
Strong supporter?
Yes.
We heard earlier this morning the Premier of South Australia talk about the challenge in terms of leadership. How do you build a constituency for a policy at a state and local level? Talk a bit about how you would see her as a constituency builder around the issue of climate change, which seems to be so contentious.
Again, this is one of Secretary McGinty's great strengths. She is a builder of consensus. She is a person who believes in collaboration. And she has a long career where she has brought people from different walks of life, perhaps even conflicting interests, to a table to work out regulatory approaches and policy approaches. She knows that in order to mediate differences, you have to really understand the case. You have to really be into the details so that you can help find solutions, perhaps a way through the disagreement that the parties themselves haven't considered. So she's really a knowledgeable person when it comes to regulatory issues, energy and the environment, and she has a tremendous work ethic.
There are some folks involved in campaigns. I don't think it may be the case with the two candidates we'll talk about this morning, who've raised the question about the role of the Department of Energy and even whether we need a Department of Energy at the national level. How do you think she would feel about that issue?
Well, she certainly would agree that we need a Department of Energy. She is, probably would be also a very strong voice for taking on some of the radical right that seems to think that climate change isn't happening and that you can just abolish things like the Department of Energy. We have candidates for president who want to abolish the Department of Education and the like. So this is a public servant who understands how government done right can in fact be a convening and organizing entity that can help build the connections between the public sector and the private sector. She also understands that real change that comes quickly is in the market. When markets move, you get quick, big change. The role of government, she understands, is to guide those markets, have rules in the marketplace, to enforce those rules, to allow competition to occur appropriately. And she certainly understands that at the end of the day, it's private capital and private investment, sometimes primed by the government with research and development dollars or commercialization dollars, that will move forward things like storage and have already started to move forward solar and wind and other renewables.
Is there a challenge, and I'm asking you this partly from your perspective, but also hers, because I know that you probably don't get a chance to talk to the candidate about all of the questions that you might be asking, something like this, but there's a Department of Energy and there's the Environmental Protection Agency. And is there a challenge in terms of how you get those two major federal agencies to kind of speak with one voice or to achieve a policy consensus and move it forward, given sort of they're not necessarily, let me put it this way, there's sometimes competing constituencies?
Yeah, and you've seen that really over the last 20, 30 years, that where the EPA and the Department of Energy haven't always been on the same page. And obviously there are separate agencies, and to some extent they become territorial. To some extent they have different missions, but also separate budgets. So I think the great thing about Katie, again, is that she understands government. She's worked for a U.S. senator. She's worked in the White House. She's been a cabinet secretary for state level. And she's been in the private sector. So she actually understands the importance of breaking down those stovepipes, those bureaucratic fiefdoms, and finding the synergies. And she's also well informed on both areas of energy and the environment. I mean, they're both technical areas that require a significant amount of time to have a good knowledge base. She's put that time in. So she certainly could run the EPA tomorrow, no learning curve. And she could certainly be the Secretary of the Department of Energy tomorrow with very little learning curve. So she's an extraordinarily well qualified person to go to Pennsylvania. And let's remember, Pennsylvania is a leading energy state. We need a U.S. senator who really understands energy and the environment. We rank second in natural gas production. We rank second in nuclear production, fourth in coal. We're in the top 15 in renewables, though we should be much higher than we are. And we rank, depending on exactly what metric you use, pretty decently in energy efficiency, though, again, we could be doing better. So to have a U.S. senator who understands energy and the intersection with the environment would be an enormous value to this state, to its economy, to its people, to its quality of life.
So you mentioned oil and the importance of oil as an energy resource here in Pennsylvania. And Ohio shares with Pennsylvania early history in the exploration of oil in this country and its development. And more recently, the development of hydraulic fracturing and what that's meant for energy resources in our nation. Is your candidate taking a position on the call from some to have a moratorium on fracturing? And if so, what's her stance and why?
Yeah, the Secretary McGinty supports strong regulations, zoning, and taxing of the natural gas industry. She has not supported a moratorium. She's been consistent. I'm not going to turn this into a debate. She armed me with all these statements from Admiral Sestak and Mayor Fetterman, where they seem to have zigged and zagged recently. Not long ago, they were eager to trumpet the value of natural gas to the local economy here in Southwest Pennsylvania. They seem to have zagged or zigged in another direction. She's been a constant. She understands that we need to transition to renewables. We need to transition to energy efficiency. She understands that we need to reduce carbon. And she understands that we have to also make sure our industries are competitive and the price of energy is important. We also have to make sure that middle-class families in Pennsylvania, and especially poor families, for whom heating bills can be a crushing burden, have access to reasonably priced energy. So for her, the way to try to make sure that all of those goals are woven together is to regulate strongly, and she has a record of regulating strongly, and to zone appropriately any energy facility, including natural gas drilling. Local governments should have a full say in where that drilling takes place. And she's also very clear that it's an outrage that here in Pennsylvania, at least, almost alone, that the gas industry pays neither a property tax on the gas, which they do in Texas and other places, nor a severance tax here. So she would regulate strongly, zone appropriately, and tax reasonably this industry, while at the same time moving forward aggressively with renewables and energy efficiency. And what we're seeing at the national level is a boom in renewables, as we also have had record amounts of natural gas produced. You know, the U.S. solar industry this year is going to produce 16,000 megawatts of new installed capacity. Katie McGinty in Pennsylvania was a leader on solar. Katie McGinty in Pennsylvania was a leader on wind, and we have a huge wind boom going on in the United States. We need to be making sure that the tax credits at the federal levels are continued and other supports for renewables are
So
continued.
she would continue to support those?
Absolutely. She absolutely understands that we have to transition to renewables, and we have to do it as rapidly and as efficiently as possible. But she's very frankly not going to mislead people about where we are today as a country and the role of nuclear, fossil fuels, and coal in the country today, and what we have to do as we transition forward.
So just to be clear, so she would, and I'm not sure that this would be something that as a senator she'd have a direct involvement in, but she wouldn't support preempting local regulation around hydraulic fracturing.
No, with the exception of things like closing the Halliburton loophole and some of the federal.
That's a different matter. Do you just want to say something about the Halliburton loophole, because that is a place where the senator will have a voice, and that's an important subject.
Look, the Safe Drinking Water Act is one of the very most important pieces of environmental legislation. We've seen how bad things go when it's not properly enforced in Flint.
Right.
Obviously, that had nothing to do with fossil fuels or anything that we're talking about. But you cannot be creating loopholes in the Safe Drinking Water Act, and Katie McGinty understands that. She's adamant that she'll join Senator Casey in his work to try to close the Halliburton loophole. So this is again somebody who is going to treat Pennsylvanians as adults, as intelligent people. She's not going to pander on these issues. She's going to listen, and she's going to make sure that we're transitioning to a cleaner and also an affordable energy system over the next 10 years. And she's excited to get to work on that.
Do you think that in this arena, something like a right to know provision around what chemicals are being used would be important?
Well, I know Katie, even when she was at the Department of Environmental Protection, and I followed her, we put up on the department's website all of the chemicals used that were reported to us. It was right up on the website. And then it was woven into state law that it was a requirement. So she's adamant about transparency as a general principle across government, but certainly as applied to the products used in any energy production, toxic chemicals in fracking, or the toxic release inventory, which is an annual release inventory that the federal government provides, very important information. All of that kind of information sharing and transparency, she would be a real champion of.
To go back to something you mentioned in passing, you talked about the importance of storage as a coming issue, and again, the Premier of South Australia talked about it, which I found interesting. Does she have some ideas about how you would pursue that, or how you would incentivize that, or who ought to be doing the research on that?
Well, the first thing, she again, genuinely understands the strategic importance of storage, about where we are in terms of the transition that is now really picking up speed, which is great. She's a few things that make her more happy than seeing a wind turbine or solar panel, and then fortunately they're proliferating even in Pennsylvania, though less rapidly than say some of our immediate neighbors like New York and Maryland. So she gets why storage is important. When she was secretary, she worked to use something called the Pennsylvania Energy Development Authority to support early stage battery manufacturing, small companies even in this area. She worked with them, providing small amounts of loans, but for a small company doing early stage work, a small loan can be enormously important. So she's actually done that kind of commercialization or early stage manufacturing support. She critically understands these things. She understands the intersection between those businesses and the college campus and the research done at a place like Carnegie Mellon University. She would be a strong proponent of making sure that federal budgets for research and development are as robust as possible. She really does get it, and I think it's just an incredible opportunity the voters of Pennsylvania have to send an energy champion to DC and a climate champion to DC at the right time, and this is the time to do it.
That sounds almost like the end of a speech, but I think we have a little bit more time, so I don't want to cut you off. You mentioned investment in new research that can enhance what our present knowledge and so on, and its relationship to the university. Has she even thought to how to better utilize what goes on in the large federal labs? For example, Oak Ridge, to take something that's not too far from here, and whether the DOE labs could play a more valuable role, both in relationship to university research, but also in the development of these key areas like energy storage and so on.
I know she's toured the National Energy Technology Lab here in the Pittsburgh area several times. She's been there. So again, she understands the role of the national labs. She is passionate about finding better ways of both producing energy and dealing with waste. For example, she opposes the deep well injection of hydraulic wastewater, which has been clearly linked to seismic activity. It causes earthquakes in certain locations. She opposes that, but she's eager to have some of the existing companies that can de-waste that water develop their technology further. And so she again would see and does see the national labs and the research and development as a critical bridge between what's the early stage commercialization and what happens in Congress when it gets to the nitty-gritty of deciding what budgets are going to actually exist for this kind of activity. She will be a champion. And I've spent, and you know this, there's a difference between sending somebody to Washington who votes the right way versus sending somebody to Washington who's got the knowledge base to be a champion. It makes all the difference in the world. And here's our chance. We've got the candidate.
If you were to, maybe this is the summary pitch you want to make for your candidate in this regard. Imagine that she is taken office. What do you think the first thing she'd undertake? Where would she want to apply herself first in this field of energy and the environment?
Well, she would apply herself first and foremost to climate, because climate sets the entire energy agenda. So she would look at things like making sure that we're doing everything possible to reduce methane emissions from the natural gas industry. She would look at ways of doing carbon capture for carbon dioxide coming out of power plants and industrial settings. She would look at solar and wind and energy efficiency, but not just in the power sector, but also in the transportation sector. She would be a proponent of electrification in cars, electric cars. So she would, and the way she goes about her work is to convene people and to bring folks from different sectors, perhaps even folks who disagree with each other, together to try to produce a piece of policy that then can, in fact, be converted into a bill or regulation. And you know, I've seen her work with people who certainly disagree with each other and probably don't like each other, and manage to produce agreement. Now, we need more of that kind of skill and expertise and commitment in DC. So that's yet another reason why she's the right person at this time.
John, I think that's a broad discussion. I don't know whether I haven't asked a question that you anticipated and that you think I should ask just to clarify anything about your candidate's position, Katie McGinty's position.
Well, I think it's clear that I have an enormous respect for her. I'm now close to 58, and I have had the good fortune of being in and out of state government 3 times and being in the private sector. And I've worked with Katie McGinty now for something like 14 years. And there is nobody in public life who I have more respect for. I've seen her in every conceivable circumstance. And she's incredibly well-briefed. Her integrity and her values are just wonderful. And when needed, she's brave. She's courageous.
So you've prompted me to think of a question that wasn't on our list, but is, I think, relevant. You know, here we've had the introduction this morning of international perspective on energy policy. How do you think, because that's critically important when we talk about climate change, as the Premier said, it's not something that can be solved by one state or one nation. How would Katie approach the international aspect of this, and in what respect do you see her as an effective advocate?
So a little bit about Katie. Katie, after her term in the Clinton White House, her service in the Clinton White House, left government and went to India to work and study there. And because Katie is an incredibly loving and engaged human being, she not only went to India, she came back with 2 orphans who she adopted. Katie gets it. Katie understands this is an interconnected world. She understands that the United States cannot succeed if the rest of the world is going to hell. And the reverse is true. The rest of the world cannot succeed if the United States is going to hell. So she understands these things. In a deeply personal way, she understands it, and in a deeply intellectual way. I just can't urge anybody who's hearing this more seriously and more passionately to vote for her than what I've said. I mean, she in so many ways is an exceptional person. And if we talk for an hour, I could tell you more and more stories like, well, she came back from India with 2 orphans who are now her 2 dear daughters, 2 or 3 daughters that she has. So it's been a delight to spend the time with you. I really appreciate the opportunity to urge everybody in this room to vote for Katie McGinty.
John, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.